The courtroom went silent. Not the ordinary kind of silence, but the kind that presses against your chest. An old man was kneeling on the cold wooden floor, his hands shaking, his back bent by 73 years of life. Across from him sat 3 expensive lawyers. Laptops open, documents stacked neatly, confidence written all over their faces. The judge was about to speak. But then he froze. His eyes widened. His hand tightened on the edge of the bench. Because in that exact moment, the judge heard a voice no one else in the courtroom could hear. It didn't come from the old man. It didn't come from the lawyers. It didn't come from anywhere in the room. It came from deep within his chest. And it said, "I am the lawyer for this old man." Before we continue, pause for a moment. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you've ever felt alone against something far bigger than you, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when Jesus becomes your lawyer. Manuel Herrera was 73 years old when he learned that justice does not always belong to those who tell the truth. He didn't learn it from the news. He didn't learn it from a book. He learned it on a quiet Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. The air was still cool as Manuel stood behind his small woodworking shop, watering a row of plants his late wife had planted decades earlier. His hands thick, scarred, and permanently marked by 50 years of honest labor moved slowly now. Age and a weak heart had taken their toll, but those hands had built a life, tables, chairs, cribs, entire homes, and one small workshop that sat on the same piece of land he had owned for most of his life. That was when the envelope arrived. A delivery man handed it to him without a word, already turning away before Manuel could even ask what it was. The envelope was heavy, official, stamped with authority. Manuel felt it before he opened it. The weight of something final. Inside was a court summons. A real estate development company, Horizon Golden Properties, was suing him for illegal occupation of land. They were demanding immediate eviction. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. 6 days. That was all the time Manuel had to defend the workshop he had built with his own hands. The house where he had raised 4 children after his wife Lucia died of cancer. The only place his grandson Carlos had ever truly called home. Manuel's knees buckled. He lowered himself onto an old wooden bench, one he had built when he was 28, clutching the paper as his vision blurred. A moment later, Carlos appeared from the back room. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" Manuel couldn't speak. He simply handed him the notice. Carlos read it aloud. And as he did, confusion turned into disbelief, then anger. "This is insane," Carlos said. "This land is yours. You've lived here forever. You have the deed. I've seen it." Manuel nodded slowly, tears pooling in his tired eyes. "I had it," he said quietly. 3 months ago, when I went to the hospital for my heart, someone broke into the shop. They stole my tools, some cash, and the metal box where I kept all the important papers. Carlos's face went pale. "But the county keeps records. There have to be copies." "I tried," Manuel said. "They told me the older files were lost in a fire years ago. My record was one of them." Carlos looked back down at the summons. The company claimed they had purchased the land 2 years earlier. They had documents, stamped, registered, perfect. And suddenly, 45 years of honest work meant nothing on paper. That night, Manuel Herrera realized something terrifying. In a courtroom, memory doesn't matter. Character doesn't matter. Truth doesn't matter. Only documents do. And he had none. That afternoon, Manuel sat alone in the workshop, staring at the empty corner where the metal lockbox used to be. For decades, that box had been his sense of security. Inside were birth certificates, old photographs, receipts yellowed by time, and the one document that mattered more than all the others, the deed to the land. He could still picture it clearly. Thick paper, official seals, his name written in careful ink, dated decades earlier, back when he and Lucia were still young and dreaming. Now it was gone. Carlos returned with a folder in his hands, breathless. He had already begun searching, calling offices, digging through old emails, scanning public databases on their aging computer. "There has to be something," Carlos said, his voice tight. "They can't just erase you." But the more they searched, the worse the truth became. The county clerk's office confirmed it. The original physical records from the late 1972 had been destroyed in a warehouse fire 10 years earlier. The digital backups were incomplete. Entire years were missing. Manuel's property file was listed as unrecoverable. Carlos slammed his fist against the table. "So, anyone can just show up with new paperwork and take someone's land?" Manuel didn't answer. Because that was exactly what was happening. 2 weeks earlier, a neighbor had mentioned seeing surveyors measuring the edges of the property. At the time, Manuel hadn't thought much of it. People measured land all the time in town, but now every memory replayed with a sharper edge. "They say they bought it 2 years ago," Carlos read from the summons again. "They're calling you a squatter." The word stung. A squatter. Manuel had been on that land since before Carlos was born, before his children were grown, before his hair turned white and his hands began to shake. "I built that shop from the ground up," Manuel said softly. "Every beam, every nail. Your grandmother used to sweep sawdust off the floor while I worked." Carlos looked around the room, the walls covered in framed photos, newspaper clippings from decades ago featuring Manuel's craftsmanship, tools repaired so many times they looked older than the building itself. "How can paper be stronger than all of this?" he asked. Manuel let out a long, tired breath. "In court," he said, "paper is everything." That evening, Carlos spread everything they could find across the workbench. Photos from the 1982 showing the workshop half-built, utility bills with Manuel's name stretching back decades, a local newspaper article praising his furniture business from 25 years earlier, handwritten statements from neighbors willing to swear he had lived there as long as anyone could remember. It looked like proof, but Manuel knew better. "None of this says ownership," he said. "It only says, 'I was here.'" Carlos looked up. "Isn't that enough?" Manuel shook his head slowly. "The law doesn't ask who lived there," he said. "It asks, who can prove it?" That night, long after Carlos had gone to bed, Manuel remained in the workshop alone. He ran his fingers along the workbench scratches and dents, telling the story of a lifetime. Each mark meant something. Each flaw had a memory. But none of it could be stamped, registered, or uploaded into a court system. For the first time in his life, Manuel felt something heavier than fear. He felt invisible, and somewhere across town, men in suits were preparing to erase him legally. The next morning, Manuel made a decision he had been avoiding. If this was a mistake, if there had been some kind of misunderstanding, then surely it could be resolved with a conversation. He had spent his entire life believing that people, when faced with the truth, would do the right thing. So he put on his cleanest shirt, straightened his worn jacket, and took the bus across town. The building that housed Horizon Golden Properties rose from the pavement like something from another world. Steel. Glass. Reflections so sharp they hurt the eyes. It stood in the most expensive part of the city, surrounded by cafes where a single cup of coffee cost more than Manuel used to earn in an hour. He paused at the entrance, watching the revolving doors spin endlessly, unsure for a moment if he belonged inside at all. But this was his land they were taking. He stepped forward. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of polished stone and perfume. Everything gleamed. Nothing creaked. No dust. No imperfections. Manuel approached the reception desk. "I need to speak with Mr. Montalvo," he said, carefully pronouncing the name he had memorized from the court papers. "It's about a lawsuit he filed against me." The receptionist, a young woman with flawless makeup and eyes that never quite met his, typed without looking up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, ma'am, but this is urgent." Her fingers paused. She looked him up and down, his calloused hands, his worn shoes, the faint smell of sawdust that never fully left him. "Mr. Montalvo doesn't meet without an appointment," she said flatly. "All legal matters are handled by our attorneys." "Please, Manuel said, lowering his voice. "Just 5 minutes. There's been a mistake. That land, they say I invaded it. I've lived there for 45 years. She sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from being inconvenienced by someone who doesn't matter. "Sir," she said, her tone firmer now, "if you don't have legal representation, there's nothing we can discuss here."
"But if I could just explain—"
"I've already explained," she interrupted. "If you don't leave, I'll have to call security." The words landed harder than any insult. Security. Manuel felt heat rise to his face. For a moment, he considered arguing, raising his voice, insisting on being heard. But then he saw the reflection of himself in the glass wall behind the desk. An old man, bent shoulders, hands that had built everything he owned. He turned and walked away without another word. Outside, the sun felt too bright, too exposed. He walked for nearly an hour without realizing where he was going. His heart pounded unevenly, forcing him to stop and catch his breath more than once. People passed him without noticing. Cars rushed by. Life moved on. When he finally made it back to the workshop, Carlos was waiting. "They wouldn't even let me talk," Manuel said quietly. Carlos clenched his jaw. "They're not just trying to win, Grandpa." Manuel nodded. "They're trying to erase me." And as he sat back down on his workbench, staring at the walls he had raised with his own hands, one truth settled heavily in his chest. This fight was never going to be fair, and the people who held the power had already decided who didn't belong. That night, Carlos refused to sleep. While Manuel rested in the back room, his breathing shallow but steady, Carlos sat alone at the old workbench with a laptop balanced on a stack of scrap wood. The computer was slow, the screen flickered when it got too warm, but it was all they had, and Carlos was determined to use it. He searched everything: old, local newspaper archives, community Facebook groups, city planning photos buried deep in forgotten web pages. Hour after hour, he followed broken links and half-dead databases, chasing anything that mentioned his grandfather's name, and slowly, pieces began to surface. A scanned photo from a 1992 neighborhood festival, Manuel's workshop, clearly visible in the background. The same faded sign hanging above the door. A 25-year-old newspaper article praising local craftsman Manuel Herrera for donating furniture to a nearby church. An interview from years earlier, where Manuel stood in front of the workshop holding a hand-carved table, smiling beside Lucia. Carlos printed everything. By morning, the workbench was covered in paper. When Manuel woke, he found his grandson surrounded by documents, eyes bloodshot but burning with determination. "Look," Carlos said, pushing a stack toward him. "This proves you've been there forever. People know you. The town knows you." Manuel sat down slowly, flipping through the pages. The photos brought memories rushing back, faces long gone, laughter trapped in frozen moments. Lucia standing in the doorway, the kids covered in sawdust, a younger version of himself, strong and hopeful. "It's beautiful," Manuel said quietly. "And it's proof," Carlos insisted. "Neighbors will testify. I talked to Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Donnelly, even the old pastor. They'll swear under oath that this land is yours." Manuel nodded, but his expression didn't change. "This proves I existed," he said. "It doesn't prove I owned anything." Carlos looked at him sharply. "That's not fair." "No," Manuel agreed. "But it's the law." He gathered the papers into a neat stack, his movements careful, almost reverent. "In a courtroom," he continued, "a picture is just a picture. A memory is just a story. They don't argue with lawyers, they argue with documents." Carlos leaned back in his chair, frustration written across his face. "So, what are we supposed to do? Just give up?" Manuel studied his grandson for a long moment. He saw himself in Carlos. The same fire, the same refusal to accept injustice quietly. It filled him with pride and fear. "No," Manuel said finally. "We don't give up." He reached out and placed his hand over Carlos's. "But we need help, real help." That afternoon, Carlos searched for lawyers who handled property disputes. Most didn't answer. Others listened for a minute before asking the same question. "Do you have the deed?" When Carlos said no, the conversation always ended the same way. One lawyer finally gave them a name, someone who sometimes took cases pro bono, a man known for fighting hard when he believed in something. Manuel folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the cardboard folder. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll go see Ma'am." Carlos nodded, a spark of hope flickering back to life. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew the truth. This lawyer wasn't just their last option, he was their last door. And if it closed, there would be nothing left between them and eviction. The law office was nothing like the glass tower downtown. It sat above a small insurance agency on the second floor of an aging brick building, its sign faded by years of sun and dust. The stairs creaked under Manuel's weight as he climbed slowly, stopping once to steady his breath, while Carlos waited behind him, pretending not to worry. Inside, the office was cramped but warm. Shelves sagged under the weight of law books. Framed certificates lined the walls, degrees from respectable schools, awards from legal aid organizations. This was not a man who chased money. This was a man who chased justice. Rodrigo Paz, the attorney whose name Carlos had been given, listened without interrupting. He was in his early 40s, sleeves rolled up, glasses perched low on his nose. As Manuel spoke, Paz took notes, occasionally glancing up with an expression that grew more serious by the minute. When Manuel finished, the room fell quiet. Paz leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "This is a hard case." Manuel nodded. He had expected that. "You've got witnesses, you've got photos, you've got proof of long-term occupation," Paz continued. "That helps. But the other side has something stronger." "The deed," Carlos said. Paz nodded. "Exactly. On paper, they own the property, and in civil court, paper carries a lot of weight." Manuel folded his hands in his lap. "But the land is mine. I paid for it. I built on it." "I believe you," Paz said quickly. "That's not the problem." He turned his computer screen slightly so they could see it. Horizon Golden Properties is known for aggressive litigation. They don't just want to win, they want to crush. They'll bury you in motions, filings, delays, and without original documentation, they'll argue you never legally owned anything. Carlos leaned forward. "But there's adverse possession, good faith occupation. 45 years should count for something." Paz gave a faint, tired smile. "You've been reading. But even that," he continued, "takes time to prove. Weeks, months, investigations, depositions. I'd need to dig into how they got their deed, whether there were irregularities, whether someone sold them something they didn't own." He paused. "And we don't have me." "How much time do we have?" Manuel asked quietly. 6 days, Paz replied. "That's nothing in the legal world." The silence returned. Finally, Manuel spoke. "Would you help me?" The question hung in the air. Paz rubbed his forehead and looked down at his desk. "I want to," he said. "I really do, but I already have 5 urgent cases this week, evictions, custody battles, people who will be on the street if I don't show up. I don't have a team. I don't have the resources to prepare properly in 6 days." Carlos's voice broke. "So that's it?" Paz looked up, his eyes heavy with something close to shame. "I'm saying that walking into that courtroom without solid documentation is like going to war without a weapon," he said. "And I can't do that to you." Manuel nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, and he meant it. When they stepped back into the afternoon heat, Carlos exploded. "This is wrong," he said. "Everyone knows you're right, but nobody will help because it's inconvenient." Manuel placed a trembling hand on his grandson's shoulder. "This is how the world works sometimes," he said gently, "especially for old men without money or influence." They walked home in silence. That night, after Carlos fell asleep, Manuel sat alone on the edge of his bed. For the first time, there were no doors left to knock on, no numbers left to call, no arguments left to make. He had reached the end of human help. And so, with nothing left to lose, Manuel did the only thing he hadn't tried yet. He got down on his knees. The house was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy kind, the kind that settles in after hope has exhausted itself. Manuel sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of the night. The wind brushing against the thin walls. A distant car passing somewhere down the road. Carlos breathing softly in the next room. Everything he loved was under that roof. And in 6 days, it could all be gone. Slowly, with effort, Manuel lowered himself to the floor. His knees protested. His heart fluttered unevenly. At 73, kneeling was no small thing. But it was a posture his body remembered well. One he had practiced every night since he was a boy. He clasped his hands together. "Jesus," he whispered. His voice trembled, not because he was afraid to speak, but because he no longer had the strength to pretend. "I'm an old man," he said. "I don't have much left to offer." His eyes burned as tears gathered. "I don't have money for lawyers. I don't have connections. I don't have the papers that men in suits care about." He paused, swallowing hard. "But you know the truth." He pressed his forehead to his knuckles. "You were there when I bought that land. You saw the work. You saw every board I lifted, every nail I drove. You saw Lucia sweeping sawdust off the floor while I worked late into the night." His voice broke. "You took her home too soon. But you stayed with me when I raised our children alone. You stayed when my body grew weak. You stayed when my heart began to fail." A tear slipped free and landed on his hands. "I never asked you for much," he said. "Just enough strength to work, enough faith to keep going." He inhaled slowly, then spoke again. This time with a different weight. "This isn't just about me, Jesus." He thought of Carlos, young, trying to be strong, carrying a burden he never asked for. "If I lose this place, he loses everything. His home, his future. The only trade I know how to give him." Manuel lifted his head slightly. "You said, you don't abandon the widow or the elderly. You said you defend the weak against the powerful." His hands trembled now, but his voice grew steadier. "I don't know how. You could fix this. I don't see a way. I've run out of options." He took a breath. "But you haven't." Then, with all the faith he had left, Manuel spoke the words that would change everything. "If I don't have a lawyer on this earth," he said softly, "then Jesus, be my lawyer." Silence followed. Not thunder, not light, not a voice, just silence. Manuel remained there for a long time, breathing slowly, letting the weight lift off his chest piece by piece. Nothing had changed around him, but something had changed within him. A calm settled where panic had lived. Not confidence, not certainty, peace. He rose carefully and returned to bed. Sleep came easier than it had in days. That night, he dreamed. He was standing in a courtroom small, alone, surrounded by faces that didn't see him. And then, suddenly, someone stood beside him. Manuel couldn't see the man's face. But he felt him, a presence steady and unshakable, and a voice deep, gentle, filled with authority said, "Do not be afraid. I will defend you." Manuel woke just before dawn. The problems were still there. The court date was still coming. The papers were still missing. But as he sat up in bed, one thought anchored itself in his heart. He might be walking into that courtroom alone, but he would not be standing there by himself. Manuel woke the next morning with a feeling he couldn't explain. Nothing in his situation had changed. The court date was still days away. The deed was still missing. The company was still coming for his land. And yet, the panic that had lived in his chest for weeks was gone. In its place was something quieter, heavier, steadier. After breakfast, Manuel told Carlos he wanted to visit Pastor Thomas. The small church sat on the edge of town, its paint faded, its sign crooked, its doors open more often than they were closed. Manuel had been attending services there for over 30 years. He had watched weddings, funerals, baptisms, and farewells pass through that sanctuary like seasons. Pastor Thomas had seen them all. The pastor listened without interrupting, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on Manuel's face. When the story ended, he reached across the desk and held the old man's hands in his own. "Sometimes," he said gently, "God allows us to walk into very dark valleys." Manuel nodded. "That's what this feels like. Not because he has forgotten us," the pastor continued, "but because he wants to remind us that he is the only light that never fails." Manuel hesitated. "What if I lose everything?" Pastor Thomas squeezed his hands a little tighter. "I've been a pastor for 45 years, he said. "I've seen things I can't explain. I've seen justice come when everyone else had already given up." He leaned in slightly. "I don't know how God will handle this, but I know this: your faith has not gone unnoticed." Manuel looked down. "I don't have anything left but faith." The pastor smiled softly. "That's usually when God does his best work." There was a pause. Then Pastor Thomas spoke again. "Go to that hearing," he said. "Tell the truth, speak it clearly, and then step back." "Step back?" Manuel asked. "Yes," the pastor said. "Let God step forward." They prayed together before Manuel left. Not a long prayer, not a dramatic one, just a quiet asking for strength, clarity, and courage. That afternoon, Carlos borrowed a suit from a friend, slightly too big, but clean and respectable. They laid out every document they had on the table, organizing them carefully, even though they both knew it wasn't enough. That evening, as they ate a simple dinner of beans and rice, Carlos watched his grandfather closely. "You don't seem as scared as before," he said. Manuel smiled. "I am scared," he admitted. "But I'm not alone in it anymore." Carlos looked up. "Do you really think God can do something in court?" Manuel considered the question. "When you've lived as long as I have," he said, "you learn something important. The question isn't whether God can." He met Carlos's eyes. "The question is whether we believe he will." That night, Manuel barely slept. He lay awake, looking at old photographs on his bedside table. Lucia holding their first child, the workshop half built, Carlos learning to use a plane for the first time. Just before dawn, he whispered into the darkness, "Tomorrow I will stand for the truth." And somewhere deep inside, that quiet fire burned a little brighter. The courthouse was built to intimidate. Concrete steps rose like a challenge, each one wide and unforgiving. The building itself dated back to another era: thick walls, narrow windows, hallways designed to echo every footstep. It was a place that reminded you, before you ever entered a courtroom, how small you were. Manuel and Carlos arrived 2 hours early. They had taken 3 buses to get there, counting coins carefully, so they'd have enough to make it home. Manuel wore the borrowed suit, the sleeves a little too long, the shoulders slightly off. Carlos wore the only dress shirt he owned, ironed so carefully the creases were still sharp. As they climbed the steps, Manuel had to stop twice. His heart thudded unevenly, his breath shallow. Each pause felt like an accusation, his body reminding him that time was no longer on his side. "Grandpa, we can slow down," Carlos said. Manuel shook his head. "We won't give them that satisfaction." Inside, the air was cool and stale, heavy with the smell of paper and disinfectant. Their footsteps echoed as they moved down the long corridor toward Courtroom 12. When they reached the door, Manuel froze. Through the narrow glass panel, he could see inside. The room was larger than he had imagined. Rows of dark wooden benches stretched backward like pews in a church, but without the warmth. At the front stood the judge's bench, elevated and distant. And at one of the tables sat Javier Montalvo. Manuel recognized him instantly from the photos Carlos had found online. Mid-50s, perfectly tailored navy suit, hair immaculate, a man used to being listened to. But Montalvo wasn't alone. 3 attorneys sat beside him, laptops open, leather briefcases on the table, stacks of folders arranged with precision. They spoke in low voices, confident, relaxed, like men who already knew the ending of the story. Carlos swallowed hard. "Look how many lawyers he has." Manuel followed his gaze and felt something sink deep into his stomach. Across the room, the other table waited for him. Empty, no briefcase, no laptop, no legal team, just a chair and a microphone. "I can't do this," Manuel whispered. "They have everything. We have nothing." Carlos placed a hand on his arm. Remember what you prayed. Remember what Pastor Thomas said. Manuel nodded, but the fear didn't disappear. As they stepped inside, conversation stopped. Every head turned. Manuel felt their eyes on him, curious, assessing, indifferent. He felt suddenly aware of every wrinkle, every tremor in his hands, every flaw the suit couldn't hide. Montalvo glanced up and smirked, not openly, not cruelly, but with the faint amusement of someone watching an inconvenience walk into place. One of the attorneys leaned toward him and whispered something. They smiled. Manuel and Carlos took their seats. The table felt cold beneath his palms. The small microphone stared back at him like an accusation. To his right, the opposing table glowed with screens and documents. To his left, nothing. A court clerk approached. "Sir," she asked, her voice weary but professional, "are you represented by counsel?" Manuel stood slowly. "No, ma'am. I'm representing myself." She sighed, not unkindly, but with the resignation of someone who had seen this before. "Do you have your documents prepared?" "I have what I could find." She nodded and moved on. 10 minutes. That's how long they had to wait for the judge. 10 minutes that stretched into something unbearable. Manuel closed his eyes and focused on breathing. His heart fluttered again, irregular and insistent. "Jesus," he whispered so softly only he could hear. "If I don't have a lawyer, be my defense." Then the side door opened. "Everyone rise." The judge entered, and with him came the moment that would decide everything. Judge Edward Salinas entered the courtroom with the weight of 35 years on his shoulders. His black robe hung neatly, his white hair combed back with precision. He had seen everything: family disputes, foreclosures, fraud, desperation dressed as arguments. Some said he was cold, others said he was fair. What everyone agreed on was this: he respected paperwork. The clerk called the case. Horizon Golden Properties versus Manuel Herrera. The attorneys for the development company rose in unison, smooth and confident. Manuel stood more slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. Judge Salinas scanned the room. His eyes lingered briefly on the lawyers, then moved to Manuel. "Mr. Herrera," the judge said, "you are representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You understand you have the right to legal counsel?" "Yes, sir, I tried. I couldn't secure one in time." The judge nodded once. He had heard that sentence many times before. "Very well," he said. "Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed." The lead attorney, a woman in her early 40s with designer glasses and a voice sharpened by practice, stood and walked confidently to the front. With a click of a remote, a large screen lit up. Satellite images filled the wall. Property lines appeared in bright colors. Documents slid into place with rehearsed precision. "Your Honor," she began, "this is a straightforward case. My client legally purchased the property located at Liberty Street, number 223, 2 years and 3 months ago. The defendant has been occupying this land without legal authorization." Manuel's heart pounded. "But that's," he began. "Mr. Herrera," the judge said firmly, without looking at him, "you will have your turn. Please remain silent." Manuel closed his mouth, his jaw tightening. The attorney continued. "These are the official deeds," she said, enlarging a document on the screen. "Properly notarized, properly recorded, fully compliant with state and county regulations." She clicked again. Drone photos of the workshop appeared. Manuel's workshop. "The defendant's structure is clearly visible here," she said calmly. "As you can see, it sits entirely within our client's property boundaries." She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, citing statutes, referencing case law, explaining timelines with professional ease. To anyone unfamiliar with the story, it was airtight. When she finished, she turned toward Manuel with an expression carefully crafted to resemble sympathy. "Your Honor," she said, "we understand that Mr. Herrera is elderly. We understand that his situation is emotionally difficult. But emotion does not override the law." She paused. "The property has a legal owner, and that owner is my client." She sat down. Javier Montalvo leaned back in his chair and nodded once, satisfied. The judge turned his attention to Manuel. "Mr. Herrera," Judge Salinas said, "you may present your defense." Manuel stood. His legs shook. There was no screen behind him, no remote in his hand, no legal team at his side, only a worn cardboard folder. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thin compared to the attorney's polished tone, "everything they said is wrong." A murmur rippled through the room. "I bought that land 45 years ago," Manuel continued. "I paid for it with my own work. I built that workshop board by board." "Do you have documentation to support that claim?" the judge asked. "I had the deed," Manuel said. 3 months ago, my workshop was robbed. They took the box where I kept all my important papers." "Did you file a police report?" "Yes, Your Honor." Manuel handed the document to the clerk. The judge reviewed it briefly. "I see that you reported a burglary," he said, "but without proof of ownership." "I tried to get copies," Manuel said, his voice breaking. "The county told me the records were lost in a fire." The attorney for Horizon Golden Properties stood immediately. "Your Honor," she said, "with all due respect, a tragic story does not constitute legal evidence." The judge removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Herrera," he said slowly, "do you have anything else?" Manuel opened his folder with trembling hands. Photos, old newspaper articles, letters from neighbors. He placed them on the table. "It's everything I have," he said quietly. The judge studied the documents. They showed a life. But the law was asking for something else, and the room could feel the verdict approaching. The judge studied the papers in silence. Photographs passed from his hands to the clerks and back again. Images of the workshop half built, then finished. Manuel younger, stronger. Lucia smiling in the doorway. Children standing knee-deep in sawdust. Utility bills followed. Newspaper clippings. Letters written in careful, earnest handwriting by neighbors who had known the place for decades. "These documents," Judge Salinas said at last, "do indicate long-term presence." Manuel's chest lifted with a fragile hope. "But," the judge continued, "presence is not the same as ownership." The word fell like a gavel. The attorney for Horizon Golden Properties rose smoothly. "If I may, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Long-term occupation can mean many things," she said, pacing a step. "Tenancy, tolerance by a previous owner, even unauthorized use that went unchallenged. None of these establish legal title." She produced another document from her briefcase and placed it on the table with precision. "We also submit this affidavit," she said, "from Mr. Robert Villegas, listed in county records as the registered owner of the property from 1985 until its sale to my client 2 years ago." Manuel's breath caught. "That can't be," he said. "I bought it in 1978 from Arturo Mendez. I never heard of a Robert Villegas." The attorney's tone softened, just enough to sound reasonable. "Your Honor, with respect, Mr. Herrera is 73. Memory can fade, records do not." The judge's jaw tightened. He looked from the affidavit to Manuel, then back again. "Mr. Herrera," he said, choosing his words carefully, "the law requires documentation. Without a registered deed, my hands may be tied." Manuel felt the room tilt. "Your Honor," he pleaded, "that is my home. I raised my children there after my wife died. It's all I have." From the gallery, Carlos rose without thinking. Tears streaked his face. "Please," he said, "everyone in the neighborhood knows it's his. I can bring 50 witnesses." "Sir," the judge said firmly, though not unkindly, "please sit down." Carlos sank back into his seat, shaking. The judge removed his glasses again, staring down at the bench. He was a man bound by procedure, by precedent, by the weight of files stacked higher than any single story. He had learned, long ago, to keep compassion from overruling the code. "Mr. Herrera," he said quietly, "do you understand the difficulty I face?" Manuel nodded. His throat felt raw. "I understand," he said. "I just don't understand how the truth can lose." A hush settled over the room. The attorney returned to her seat, confident. Montalvo checked his watch. The judge drew a breath, preparing to speak the words that would end it. That was when Manuel did something no one expected. He stepped back from the table. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to his knees. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The cold wood pressed against his skin. His knees screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He lifted his trembling hands and looked upward, past the bench, past the lights, past the ceiling itself. "Jesus," he said, his voice steady now, filling the room. "You know the truth." The judge froze. The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. "If I have no lawyer here," Manuel continued, "be my lawyer. If I have no papers these men will accept, be my witness." Silence swallowed the court. And in that stillness, something shifted. Something no statute could explain. Manuel remained there on the floor. Not collapsing. Not begging. Kneeling. The courtroom, once filled with the quiet confidence of procedure, felt suddenly exposed, as if something unseen had stepped inside. "Jesus," Manuel said again, louder now, his voice no longer trembling. "You were there when I bought that land. You saw the work. You saw every board I lifted, every nail I drove with these hands." He raised his palms, scarred and shaking, for everyone to see. "You saw me raise my children there after my wife died. You saw me stay honest when it would have been easier not to. You saw everything." No one interrupted him. Not the judge. Not the lawyers. Not even the bailiff. "If I don't have a lawyer in this court," Manuel continued, "then you be my lawyer. If I don't have papers these men will accept, then you be my witness." His eyes filled, but his voice did not break. "Because I know you defend the weak. I know you do not let the powerful crush the poor forever. And I know you see the truth, even when men choose not to." The silence thickened. The lead attorney shifted in her seat, discomfort flickering across her face. This was not part of the script. This was not something cross-examination could control. Javier Montalvo frowned, irritation tightening his jaw. He glanced toward the judge, expecting an immediate reprimand. It didn't come. Judge Salinas sat completely still. His hands gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles whitening. His breathing slowed, not in judgment, but in shock. Because in that moment, something happened that no one else in the room could perceive. A pressure, a presence, and then a voice. Not spoken aloud, not imagined, not drifting through the air. It came from within his chest, clear and unmistakable. "I am the lawyer for this old man." The judge's eyes widened. His heart pounded hard enough that he thought it might betray him. He looked around the room instinctively, searching for the source. No one else reacted. The attorneys were still watching Manuel. The clerk was frozen mid-note. The gallery remained silent. But Judge Salinas knew deeply, unshakably, that he had heard something real. The courtroom felt different now. He couldn't explain how. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the air heavier, as if authority itself had entered the room and was waiting. He swallowed. Manuel slowly lowered his hands and remained kneeling, eyes closed. The judge leaned forward. "I'm calling a recess," he said suddenly, his voice unsteady. 45 minutes. The gavel struck wood harder than intended. Gasps rippled through the room. The attorneys stared at one another, confused. Montalvo opened his mouth to protest. But the judge was already standing. He turned and exited through the side door without another word. Carlos rushed forward to help Manuel back to his feet, his hands shaking as badly as his grandfather's. "What just happened?" Carlos whispered. Manuel didn't answer. But deep in his chest, something stirred small, fragile, but unmistakable. Hope. Because the lawyer he had asked for had just arrived. Judge Salinas closed the door to his chambers and leaned against it, his chest rising and falling too fast. In 35 years on the bench, he had never left a courtroom like that. Never. He crossed the room on unsteady legs and sat down heavily behind his desk, the polished wood suddenly feeling unfamiliar beneath his palms. The law books on the shelves volumes he had trusted his entire career seemed to watch him in silence. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. Stress. Fatigue. A long career, finally catching up with the I am. That had to be it. He ran cold water over his face in the small bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as he stared at his reflection. The man looking back at him was not young anymore. White hair, deep lines. A face shaped by decades of decisions that altered lives. "I imagined it," he said aloud. "I had to." But when he closed his eyes, the voice returned, not louder, not threatening, certain. "I am the lawyer for this old man." Salinas stepped back as if struck. He hadn't heard that voice since childhood, since the days when faith had been simple, before law school taught him that truth had to be proven, or it didn't exist. He sank into his chair. "God," he whispered, his voice breaking despite himself. "If that was you, then I need help, because I can only judge what I see. And you see everything." Silence followed. Then something impossible happened. The computer on his desk flickered. Once. Twice. The mouse cursor moved. Salinas froze. He hadn't touched it. The cursor slid across the screen with slow intention and clicked on a folder buried deep within the court's internal system. One protected by layers of security, one he had never accessed in his life. "No," he whispered. The folder opened. Inside was a scanned document, yellowed, old, unmistakably authentic. A deed. His breath caught. The names leapt off the screen. Manuel Herrera, buyer. Arturo Mendez, seller. The address matched perfectly. The date, the 15th of June, 1978. His heart skipped. "That's not possible," he said. He checked the metadata. Uploaded 8 minutes ago. Uploaded by... The field was blank. No user. No log. No explanation. His hands began to shake. Salinas grabbed the phone and dialed an internal extension. "Martin," he said to the head archivist, "I need you in my office." Immediately. 3 minutes later, Martin Ochoa stood in the doorway, 58 years old, 30 years in court records, a man who trusted systems more than people. "Yes, Your Honor?" Salinas turned the screen toward him. "Explain this." Martin adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. The color drained from his face. "That document," he said slowly, "was listed as destroyed in the fire 10 years ago. But it's here," Salinas said, "and it was uploaded minutes ago." Martin shook his head. "That's impossible. Our system doesn't allow files to be uploaded without a user ID. Everything is logged." "Check the physical archive," Salinas said. "Now." Martin hurried out. Alone again, Salinas stared at the screen. The deed glowed softly, undeniable. "Has justice into more. Do justice without fear." The words echoed inside him. 10 minutes later, Martin burst back into the room, clutching a folder. "Your Honor," he said, breathless, "you need to see this." Inside were physical copies, aged paper, original seals, signatures intact. The file, Martin continued, his voice shaking, was in the exact place it should have been, on the correct shelf, in the correct box, as if it had never been lost. Tucked inside was a small yellow note. Fresh, clean, written in simple handwriting. "The truth never dies." Martin swallowed hard. "Your Honor, do you believe in miracles?" Salinas closed his eyes. He already knew the answer. Because 45 minutes were almost over. And when he returned to that courtroom, he would not return as the same man. When Judge Salinas walked back into the courtroom, everyone felt it. He moved with a different gravity now, slower, steadier, as if the weight he carried was no longer uncertainty, but resolve. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laptops were closed, backs straightened. "Please be seated," he said. His voice was firmer than before. Manuel sat with Carlos's hand clasped tightly in his own. He could feel his grandson's pulse racing. Across the aisle, Javier Montalvo leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the faintest smile still playing on his lips. The attorneys adjusted their notes, ready to finish what they believed was already decided. Judge Salinas looked directly at Manuel. "Mr. "Herrera," he said, "before I issue a ruling, I need to clarify a few matters." He turned to the lead attorney. "Counsel, you presented deeds claiming your client purchased the property 2 years ago. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied confidently, "properly notarized and recorded." "And you stated the property was acquired from Mr. Robert Villegas," the judge continued. "That is correct." The judge nodded slowly. "Interesting," he said, "because during the recess, a document was discovered in the court's archives." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Judge Salinas lifted a set of papers. "This," he said, holding them up, "is an original deed dated the 15th of June, 1978. It shows that Manuel Herrera purchased the property at Liberty Street, number 223, from Arturo Mendez." Manuel's breath caught in his throat. Carlos squeezed his hand so hard it hurt. The attorney shot to her feet. "Your Honor, that's impossible. The county has no record of such a deed." "That was true," the judge replied evenly. "Until it wasn't." He gestured to the clerk, who passed copies to both tables. "This document exists in both our digital and physical archives," the judge continued. "It bears authentic seals, verified signatures, and matches the property description exactly." The attorney's composure cracked. "Then it must be a forgery." "On the contrary," the judge said, "I ordered an expedited review by a certified document examiner during the recess." Murmurs filled the courtroom. "The examiner confirms the 1,978 deed is authentic," the judge said. "Paper, ink, seals, everything is consistent with documents from that period." He paused. "And the examiner found irregularities in the deeds submitted by your client." The room went still. "Specifically," the judge continued, "the registration seal on your documents contains a verification code that did not exist at the time they were allegedly recorded. That code was introduced only 18 months ago." Javier Montalvo stood abruptly. "This is absurd. Someone is setting me up." "Sit down," Judge Salinas said sharply, "or you will be held in contempt." Montalvo sat, his face flushed. The judge leaned forward. "If Mr. Herrera purchased the property in 1978, he said, then Mr. Villegas could not have legally owned it in 1985, which means someone sold property they did not own." The attorney opened her mouth, then closed it. "The conclusion is unavoidable," the judge said. "The deeds presented by Horizon Golden Properties are fraudulent." Manuel felt tears spill over. He covered his face, shoulders shaking. Carlos wrapped his arms around him. Judge Salinas straightened. "In the matter of Horizon Golden Properties versus Manuel Herrera," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "I find entirely in favor of the defendant." A gasp swept the room. "The eviction claim is dismissed," he continued. "Mr. Herrera is recognized as the lawful owner of the property. I further order the issuance of updated official records reflecting this fact." He paused, then added, "Given the evidence of intentional fraud, this court orders financial restitution to Mr. Herrera and refers this matter for criminal investigation." Javier Montalvo shouted as officers approached, but no one was listening anymore. Judge Salinas turned to Manuel. "Mr. Herrera," he said, his voice softer now, "this court nearly failed you. I am sorry." Manuel rose slowly, helped by Carlos. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, "for seeking the truth." The judge shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "You asked for a lawyer, and someone far greater than any of us answered." As Manuel and Carlos left the courtroom, applause broke out, hesitant at first, then rising, unstoppable, and Manuel knew, with a certainty deeper than words, the case had never been about land. It had been about whether the truth would be defended. And it had been. The courtroom emptied slowly. Some people left, shaking their heads, others wiping their eyes. A few stood in silence, as if afraid that speaking too soon might break whatever had just happened. Manuel Herrera didn't rush. He stood near the wooden table where he had nearly lost everything, his hand resting on the worn surface, grounding himself in the reality of it all. Carlos stayed close, still holding his grandfather's arm, not because Manuel was weak, but because both of them were overwhelmed. Outside, reporters were already gathering. Cameras, microphones, questions flying faster than answers. "Mr. Herrera, how does it feel to win without a lawyer? Do you believe this was divine intervention? Where did the document come from?" Manuel paused on the courthouse steps. The sun felt warmer than it had that morning. "I just want to say one thing," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "When you are completely alone, when you have no strength left, God is still there. He sees, He hears, and He acts." The clip went viral within hours. Some called it impossible. Others called it coincidence. But no one could explain how a deed lost for 10 years appeared exactly when it was needed. Within days, investigators uncovered more. Horizon Golden Properties had done this before. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. Elderly homeowners, families with limited resources, people who couldn't afford lawyers, fraudulent documents, manipulated records. 23 additional cases surfaced, and one by one, the truth came out. Judge Salinas watched it unfold with a humility he had never known before. In the weeks that followed, he returned to church quietly at first, sitting in the back. He prayed before hearings now, not for outcomes, but for wisdom. "I spent my life believing justice lived only in documents," he later admitted. "That day, I learned it lives in something far greater." Manuel received compensation for damages, more money than he had ever held at one time. His children urged him to use it for comfort, for better medication, for upgrades to the workshop. He agreed, but not entirely. "There are others like me," he said one evening, sitting at the same bench where the journey had begun. "People who don't have papers, people who don't have lawyers, people who don't have time." And so, with the help of Pastor Thomas and a small group of volunteer attorneys, young men and women moved by the story, Manuel founded a legal aid fund. They called it the Defender of the Elderly. Its mission was simple. No senior should lose their home because they couldn't afford a lawyer. Carlos enrolled in law school the following year. He studied late into the night, driven by something deeper than ambition. He wanted to be the kind of lawyer his grandfather had prayed for, the kind who defended truth, not just contracts. The foundation grew. Families were helped. Homes were saved. Cases once considered hopeless were reopened. And everywhere Manuel went, people told him the same thing. "Your story gave me courage." Years passed. Manuel's hands grew weaker, but his spirit never did. He taught young apprentices woodworking in the shop, passing down not just skills, but faith. "When you reach the end of yourself," he told them, "that's usually where God begins." 5 years after the trial, Manuel passed peacefully at the age of 85. At his funeral, the courthouse was full. Judge Salinas spoke through tears. "Manuel Herrera was not a lawyer," he said, "but he taught me what justice truly is. When Jesus is your lawyer, the verdict is already decided. We're just waiting for it to be spoken." The foundation continues today. Thousands of families have been helped, homes preserved, dignity restored, and Carlos, now an attorney, still keeps the same prayer written on a card in his wallet. "If I have no lawyer on this earth, Jesus, be my lawyer." Because this story was never just about one man. It was about what happens when faith steps into places ruled by fear, when truth stands against power, and when God chooses to defend the ones no one else will. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to Heaven Walks With Us. Share it with someone who might be facing their own impossible courtroom. And in the comments, tell us, when has God defended you, when you had no one else left to stand for you? Because when Jesus is your lawyer, the case is never lost.